Today, Cities of Migration presents a groundbreaking initiative in our Big Ideas series. For the next 45 minutes, we are joined by Adolfo Hernandez, Director of Chicago's Office of New Americans, and Suzette Brooks Masters of the J.M. Kaplan Fund in New York, to hear about how Chicago is working with newcomers to build a thriving and welcoming city. Under Adolfo's leadership, the City of Chicago has launched the ambitious Chicago New Americans Plan, as well as its Welcoming City Ordinance, and much more, all part of a master plan to make Chicago the most immigrant-friendly city in the nation. Here to help us get the whole story, I'm delighted to introduce Suzette Brooks Masters as today's special host. Suzette will interview Adolfo after his presentation, and then we'll open the floor to questions from our audience. For those of you working in the U.S., Suzette needs little introduction. Since 2007, Suzette has directed immigration-related grant-making at the J.M. Kaplan Fund, a private family foundation in New York City. At the fund, she focuses primarily on immigrant integration issues, including innovative state and local policy, educational access, professional workforce integration, and receiving community engagement. In 2008, Suzette helped found the prestigious National E Pluribus Unum Awards in Immigrant Integration. Indeed, Suzette's hand is present in many of the cutting-edge initiatives that are rapidly changing the immigration scene in the U.S. today. Suzette, I'd like to welcome you to the Cities of Migration Learning Exchange.
Thank you, Kim. It's my pleasure to introduce Adolfo to all of you today and to participate in today's discussion. Adolfo Hernandez is the first director of Chicago's new Office of New Americans, an office dedicated to making Chicago the most immigrant-friendly city in the world. Prior to leading the Office of New Americans, Mr. Hernandez served for 10 years in a number of policy and advocacy roles in Chicago. He was involved in health organizing, affordable housing, gang violence reduction, transportation and transit policy, immigration and integration policy. So needless to say, he's had lots of exposure to lots of issues, and he brings all of this knowledge and his work with many different communities and constituencies to bear in his new position. He also brings considerable energy and people skills to the table, which you'll see on display today. Finally, Adolfo was born and raised in Chicago and is the son of Mexican immigrants. Without further ado, I'd like to present Adolfo Hernandez, who will be discussing Chicago's exciting New Americans Plan. Adolfo?
Great. Thank you, Suzette, for that introduction. Hello to everyone on the call, and I'm glad to be here with you today, and I'm excited to share our Chicago New Americans Plan with you. So I'm going to move quickly through some of the plan and then dive into some of the initiatives a little bit more closely. But before getting specifically into the plan, I think it's important to note how this office even was created. As Suzette mentioned, this is the first time the city has had an office dedicated to immigrant integration. In a city like Chicago, we have a history of being immigrant-friendly. But this is the first time that we're intentionally looking at leveraging the contributions of immigrants and making sure that city services and the municipality itself is a partner to immigrants as opposed to a barrier. So the slide we're looking at here is actually a point from the mayoral transition plan. For those not familiar with Chicago, Mayor Emanuel is the first new mayor to the city in over 22 years. So I think the advocacy groups were very wise in taking advantage of a fresh mayor coming into office and did a good job of laying out a vision for the way a municipality could be supportive of immigrant populations. And so this is something that came to the forefront during the campaign, during the mayoral campaign in our city, where this was explicitly stated as a goal that the mayor's office would create a position in office dedicated to immigrant integration. Obviously, it's not something that could be done by one person. So one of the first things I did was make sure to assemble an advisory committee that represented a cross-section of expertise areas and representation from our city. So we wanted to make sure that we had folks from the advocacy and community-based organizations, more of the traditional partners. But we also wanted to make sure that we had a representation from our academic institutions, our education and faith-based institutions, and I think most notably from our private sector, our chambers of commerce, our small and medium-sized business owners, which in the city of Chicago about 50% more likely to open up a small business than native-born. So we wanted to make sure that we were representing and getting perspective from all the different sort of areas of immigrants that come to our city. So what you're looking at now is the list of those advisory members. But one of the things I will say was I spent my first 2 months in this position. I was appointed by the mayor in December of 2011, and I spent the first 2 months just meeting and talking to groups all around the city and having phone calls with groups around the country. I think we got through maybe 250 to 300 groups within 2 months, and that gave me a really good baseline of where some of the gaps and challenges were, but also where some of the strengths and opportunities were. So now we'll go a little bit into the plan, and here's sort of this next slide was something that was important to frame, not just for our advisory committee, but also for everyone in general in terms of when we talk about this plan. There's often, when talking about immigration, this focus on comprehensive immigration reform in the states here at the federal and national level. What we really wanted to focus on is what can we do at the municipal level. Obviously, we could use the mayor's profile and his voice to support things like comprehensive immigration reform at the national level, but we also needed to focus on how we make our agencies, our city services, more welcoming, more accessible to folks here locally. So we wanted to focus this plan on on immigrants as an asset, which is also sort of an important way that we're looking at the immigration conversation nationally. At least in the States, I think oftentimes when you hear about immigration, some of the words that are attached to it are illegal or undocumented or low-skilled or Mexican. What we wanted to say is we have over 140 countries represented in our city, and we recognize them as vital to our local economy, to our culture, and they make immigrants help make us a globally competitive city. So we really wanted to focus on promoting our economic growth, making sure that we were one of the most competitive cities in the country, but also valuing and improving the day-to-day experiences of immigrants. What this plan doesn't focus on at all is the state and federal level bills, or even defending the presence of immigrants. What we're saying is that we are clear that they're absolutely vital, and we're not even going to get into that conversation. So what the plan actually is, it's a broad array of programs and initiatives, some citywide, some focused specifically on departments and agencies or ordinances that want to improve the day-to-day experiences of immigrants, but also will leverage contributions and benefits for the entire city. One of the things, again, as I mentioned, we historically have been a city of immigrants. Cities like New York, San Francisco, LA, Chicago have been gateway cities and have been built by immigrants. To give you a sense of our size and scale, we have about 2.6 million people. Of those 2.6 million in the city proper, we have about 1 in 5 Chicagoans is foreign-born. So that gives you a sense of just how many immigrants are here. And we have these strong, culturally vibrant ethnic hubs all around the city. And again, we think of those as an asset. And it's important to say that that's something we recognize and that we value. And I think the city as a whole does that. But what we wanted to say is that this plan isn't just about benefiting immigrants. We know that when we help immigrants thrive, that it helps the city as a whole thrive. So here what you're looking at is what are some of the economic impacts if we realize the goals set out in the New Americans Plan. And this is really important for us to articulate, that it couldn't just be a plan with some lofty ideas and goals, but no metrics for success. So we wanted to make sure that we were setting some very clear, tangible goals, and that the impacts to the overall city as a whole, not just immigrant communities, were explicit. So when we help our immigrant-owned businesses flourish, we know that we could create between 10 and 20,000 more jobs. And this is based on looking at what some of the most entrepreneurial cities in the country are, cities like Atlanta and LA, who are at the top of the class in terms of entrepreneurial activity. We're somewhere down like in the 20th spot in terms of cities with entrepreneurial activity. If we moved our way up into those top 5 areas, and we already know that percentage-wise immigrants are more likely to start those new businesses, we could create between 10 and 20,000 more jobs. We know that if we double the exports from our immigrant-owned businesses, which they are already more likely to export because of their connection to their country of origin, that we could create between 24 and 30,000 jobs. And these aren't just jobs for immigrants. These are jobs for our city. So we wanted to make sure that we're looking at every area. Any initiatives that we propose had to have a clear benefit, again, not just for immigrants, but for the city as a whole. The way we broke down the plan was really into 27 initiatives in 3 categories. And this was very much on purpose for us because this aligned with the mayor's other vision and goals for the city. If you looked at his transition plan when he was elected, he focused on our growth, our economic development, our youth, making sure our young people were successful and had clear paths to college and careers, and our communities. So that's the way we broke up our plan, and what I'll do now is highlight maybe a few of the initiatives, but I've included all of the initiatives in the plan that you could review at a later time. So the first section, and it's the first section very much on purpose, is focused on the contributions that immigrants make to our economy. So you can look at things like an export strategy, a small business incubator, better training for our chambers, tourism to our immigrant neighborhoods. The one I'll highlight is we started doing these pop-up city services where we're taking our business affairs services out into the communities. We're doing these workshops in Spanish, in Korean, in Mandarin, in Polish, which are some of the top immigrant populations in our city. We're making sure that we're removing the barriers to City Hall by actually going out into communities and delivering the information people need in the language they speak. We also want to make sure we're developing our human capital, that we have the talent to attract employers and to fill jobs and skills gaps. We also wanted to make sure that we're looking at the children of immigrants who may face some additional challenges and barriers. So we've identified a few strategies for making sure that they are being thought of as schools are planning their policy or programming. And one of the things that we've supported is the Deferred action policy for young people in the city of Chicago, where we hosted on August 15th about 12,000 young people going to a city location to apply for deferred action. So we know with a student body of about 400,000 in our Chicago public schools, there's an overwhelming need for information about immigration policies, and it's a great distribution hub for that information. I'm going to fly through some of these a little bit more quickly, but we're looking at how we help parents in schools. We know that parents are absolutely vital to making sure that their children succeed within those institutions, so we want to make sure we're paying attention to them. And politically, this was probably one of the more difficult things for us to work on, was our welcoming city ordinance, which some of you may be familiar with the sanctuary city ordinances of the 80s and 90s. And what this does is really an update and expansion of that ordinance to make sure that we were keeping up with the realities of how immigration enforcement was happening. So we wanted to make sure that our local law enforcement was never enforcing national federal immigration law. And that was on purpose because we thought it would be to the detriment of trust between our local law enforcement and our communities. And we wanted to make sure that people felt comfortable coming forward when they were the victims of a crime, but also when they were the witnesses of the crime, that they wouldn't be worried about deportation. And so there's another set of strategies around access to services, public safety. One of the last ones I'll mention is specifically hosting our Citizenship Celebrations, which this is an opportunity to celebrate immigrants who have gone about the legal process. What you're looking at is an image of Mayor Emanuel with USCIS Director Alejandro Mayorkas hosting the first ever citizenship naturalization ceremony in our city council chambers here at the city of Chicago. And this was just in June of last year. The mayor is committed, the city is committed to hosting these in prominent city locations throughout the year as a message to say that we are an immigrant-friendly city and that we celebrate our immigrants here. This slide's a little bit hard to read, but what I want to make sort of clear is, again, we've set very clear goals and initiatives, and we want to be able to measure the impact of them. So what you're looking at is how we're going to measure success in each of the areas to make sure that we are on the right path. And if we're not successful with one of these strategies, we won't just continue to do it. We'll make sure to make adjustments and give ourselves the leeway to be the most efficient, the most helpful as possible. And finally, accountability. This advisory committee doesn't only serve to give us ideas about what we should be doing, but they'll serve as a convening group to make sure that we are on track, that we're actually implementing. One of the things that I think often happens with with city plans or any kind of municipal plan is that they look great and then they sit on the shelf. And we have 50 people that are going to make sure that we're implementing that plan. We've already implemented about 3 of the initiatives, and there's about 24 more that we've committed to implementing within the next 2.5 years. And this is something that is absolutely critical. Again, setting lofty goals, plans, and ambitious goals is easy to do. Maybe not politically easy, but it's easy to do. What's hard to do is making sure that it gets implemented. And this is a critical part of when we created the plan. We also built an implementation plan to make sure that this is something that didn't sit on the shelf, and that we realized the mayor's goal of making Chicago the most immigrant-friendly city in the country. Some of maybe the last things I'll mention here is that what the mayor wanted to do, not just through the creation of this office and the creation of this plan, and some of the legislation we supported, is really throw down a challenge to other cities around the country, and I'd like to say around the world. He has set this goal of making Chicago the most immigrant-friendly city in the country. And what we want to do is make sure that we have a race to the top. We saw places like Arizona and Alabama who may have been racing each other to make themselves the most unwelcoming places in the country. And what we say is, great, we welcome the people that are leaving your states to the city of Chicago. We don't only tolerate immigration here, we welcome it. We know that it refreshes us, it brings new ideas, it brings innovation. And so we want to compete with other cities. We think cities are naturally competitive, and we want to be an immigration hub. We want people coming here. We think it adds to the quality of life and to our economic vitality. So what we see this plan doing is helping provide a model for other cities that may not all be at the same level of Chicago, but they may be able to take pieces of this plan that may be appropriate for their city and use them as they please. So this is very much about sharing, but it's also about competing and making sure that we retain our status as one of the most globally competitive cities in the world. So with that, thank you, and I apologize for moving through some of those slides a bit quickly, but I want to make sure that we have some time for conversation, so thank you.
Thank you so much, Adolfo. That was a fantastic breezing through the breezy cities, or the windy cities, new plan. I'd like to dig a little bit deeper for the next few minutes on some of the aspects of the plan and implications for cities in other parts of the country and across the world. So the first thing I'd like to dig a little deeper on is what you discussed at the very beginning of your presentation about how the plan came to be. So you mentioned that the new mayor of Chicago was interested in freshening things up, and you also mentioned that there was some pressure that was brought to bear on him to make sure that immigrants and immigrant integration issues were front and center. You also mentioned that you had a process of engaging multiple stakeholders at the beginning of when you first took the position, reaching out to lots and lots of people, and then engaging them more formally as part of this advisory committee. So that will then play a role in making sure that there's accountability for the plan. So I'd like your thoughts on both those pieces, the role of NGOs and other advocates in pushing local governments to do more, because they're not always going to do it on their own. They might need some prodding. And then also on the role of this constituency building, multi-stakeholder constituency building, in getting the kind of community buy-in to make sure this plan isn't only about immigrants, but is about leveraging their skills for the benefit of the whole community, as you mentioned. So could you go a little deeper on those two aspects?
Sure, and those are great questions, and I can describe specifically during the campaign. We have a local advocacy group which is really well known across the country, the Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights, ISER, that did a lot of work during the campaign to create a clear vision for what a municipality could do and what one of the mayoral candidates could do to make Chicago the most immigrant-friendly city in the country. And I think a big part of what worked in their strategy was laying out some tangible goals. So the idea for creating something like an Office of New Americans actually came out of one of their meetings with the then candidate, Mayor Emanuel. So I think one of the most important thing NGOs can do, and this is as someone who comes from a background in the nonprofit world for over 10 years, is not just saying that the status quo isn't working or saying we need to do something more, but it's actually developing some of the ideas and strategies for our elected officials to implement. The reason I think that's so important is you may have an elected official who is open to an idea, who may be willing to listen to an idea or an issue, but may not have a clear idea of how to move forward. And that's an important role, I think, for NGOs to play, is to give our elected leaders, as well as some of our other municipal leaders, clear ways that they can be supportive and tangible things that they can do. And I think that's one of the most difficult things that maybe an NGO could tackle, but it's probably one of the most effective and useful. In terms of the accountability, again, I think what I brought to this role was my external perspective as an advocate, and I still like to think of myself as an internal advocate. What was so important to me was to make sure that we had community buy-in, that we had buy-in from NGOs, from the private sector, from faith and academic institutions. And I also had that, I wanted community buy-in for several reasons, partially for selfish reasons. I don't think any city has a large bucket of money to dedicate to immigrant integration. So what was absolutely clear to me from the onset is that we would need strong partnerships with people across these sectors to implement any of these initiatives. There are very few of the initiatives in the plan which will only rely on city government or city services. A lot of it would have to rely on really creative and innovative partnerships between private sector, small businesses, NGOs, and city government. I think for municipalities, it's important to think about it can add some challenges to the process. Having 50 voices in a room and trying to build consensus is not an easy process, but I think what you end up with in the end is a much better quality of a product. And you also end with community buy-in, where you have partners and people sitting at the table who are willing to roll up their sleeves and get some of the work done, as opposed to showing up at a meeting saying, I've come up with all the ideas and now I need help. So I think that was absolutely critical, and it's something that we have a really great NGO community in the city of Chicago, and they've all been willing to sit at the table and to be partners on helping to implement this plan.
Great. Thanks, Adolfo. Now I want to shift gears a little bit and ask you, based on the work that you've done, what your recommendations might be for other cities that want to be more welcoming. And what I mean by that is Chicago, like some other cities, has been leading a movement of cities specifically seeking to attract and retain immigrants, right? Because I know that Chicago has lost some population, a number of cities are losing population and are viewing immigrants as a key factor in preserving their economic vitality over time. So there are clearly in the Chicago plan a number of initiatives that have to do with economic vitality and making sure that immigrants can contribute. There are also elements that have to do with using government services in the best possible way to make sure that immigrants can access all the services they need. But there's another element, I might call it the secret sauce, that can make for a really coherent and successful integration initiative overall, which is this welcoming component and what that means. So I was wondering if you could try to unpack that somewhat more intangible tone setting, leadership, making sure that the polity and the whole society and community is working well together, that immigrants feel included, which is more than just about services, more than just about, getting loans to help them start businesses. Can you try to get at that more culture-based piece?
Sure, and so there's a few questions in there. And I think from the economic perspective, what was clear to us is that's a story that hasn't been told as often or as prominently. And what we wanted to make sure, and in a lot of ways, I think of our plan as an economic development plan for the city of Chicago, and all of the strategies, our primary strategy is supporting our immigrant populations. So, this may seem counterintuitive to maybe folks in the advocacy world who think, that's not the reason we do these things. And as a son of once undocumented immigrants, it's not the reason I do this work. but it's a message that's going to win people who maybe aren't advocates over. And that's a really important sort of point to make, that we need to tell the story of immigrants being assets and contributors to our cities and to our country, not people who rely on just on our services or the goodness of other people's hearts, but they're people who take risks to come here and work and sacrifice and make our cities richer and stronger. And that's a really important tone and story to tell. So that's why we focus at least on the economic messaging. But I think you're absolutely right about the special sauce of making sure that we're a welcoming city. Just late last week, I was in a meeting with some of the newest tech businesses in our city. 1/4 of all new tech startups are started by immigrants, and that's across the country. But one of the things that this group kept talking about was how we needed to, there was more to quality of life than just the business environment. There was how they felt when they walked into a library, when they interacted with police, when they went to one of our Chicago public schools, when they went to one of our city agencies, whether they could talk to someone in their language. So these were prominent business people from around our city who were also talking about this quality of life, this welcoming. And I think that's one of the things that we've been thinking about actively as we develop specifically policies and programs, that we're also thinking about what this culture looks and feels like. And so we want to make sure that we're creating opportunities for exchange between some of our business corridors, that we're developing training for our police officers, for our teachers, for our educational institutions. So much of what I want to make sure that we do is that we're institutionalizing some of these changes and not just doing a one-day workshop, that we're not just doing a one-day community exchange, but rather that we're creating opportunities and venues for these exchanges to happen on a regular basis, and that we're doing them in prominent city locations, which sends a very clear message to the city as a whole that we're an international city, we're a city of immigrants, we're a welcoming city, and it's one of the reasons that we thrive economically and socially as well as culturally.
Okay, thank you, Adolfo. What I want to do now is have you reflect on how different conditions make different kinds of tone setting and policy making possible in different cities. So obviously we have traditional gateway cities like Chicago that have lots of experience with immigrants, perhaps are not as hostile to or nervous about new immigrants coming into their communities. And then we have other parts of the country in the United States where there's been a lot of recent immigration in places that were very homogeneous. There are political differences in terms of whether the platform of a particular party that might be in a leadership role in a city is pro or anti-immigrant or maybe unsure. Can you unpack for some of our participants on the call, depending on the particularities of their cities, background information or context, what's possible and how you might want to start a little bit differently perhaps in a city that doesn't have all the ducks in a row the way they were perhaps in Chicago?
Right, and one of the ways I describe what's happening in Chicago is that I feel like we're in a bit of a bubble where we have a city, a municipality, a county, and a state that have taken very progressive stances on immigrants and immigration laws in general. So we've also felt a bit of a responsibility to continue to push further and harder and faster to set models for other places around the country. But what's also very clear is that even just 30 minutes outside of Chicago, you may have a suburb where the environment is completely different. And what we tried to do in this plan, as we were creating it, is we were creating a plan for the city, but we also wanted to have a plan that could be shared, where pieces of it could be adapted to different political realities, to different cultural realities. And I think that's something that the NGO community particularly should be attuned to. And I think even, for example, for municipal staff who may be sensitive to this issue or care about it, I think there are plenty of opportunities to do things that are immigrant-friendly, that aren't necessarily controversial. One of the things that I am incredibly proud of is our naturalization initiative, and this is a partnership with ICER, our local NGO that focuses on these issues. And this is specifically focused on helping people who have undergone the legal process, who are here legally. I mean, even the most staunch of anti-immigrant sentiment or legislators would say we need a legal process. Well, we have in the state of Illinois about 350,000 people who have undergone that legal process and who just need a little help getting that rest of the way to become citizens. So they're legal permanent residents. When they become citizens, they earn more. They pay more in taxes. They tend to own homes at a higher rate. We see poverty levels decrease. We see more women in the workforce. These are all things that I don't care where you're a mayor, what city you're in, these are all things that are great for cities. So our naturalization initiative, which focuses on helping 10,000 people to become citizens over the next 2.5 years, is beneficial and non-controversial because we're helping people who have already taken the legal steps to become citizens. I think some of the things, for example, like our welcoming city ordinance, which makes sure that we don't have our local law enforcement enforcing federal immigration law, is one that's very difficult politically to make. It's one that cities can make for a variety of reasons. We've decided, and because of our status as a gateway city, I think we were able to take that approach. What's really interesting is I've seen smaller cities around the country that have experienced an inflow of immigrants take these positions as well. And part of it's because there's been an active NGO community building relationships with local law enforcement and getting local law enforcement to understand that there's an overall detriment to public safety when there's a large segment of the population that doesn't feel safe interacting or communicating with police. The most important thing I think about figuring out where you are is actually as a municipal employee, as someone who works at the mayor's office, I feel a responsibility to go out into communities and have direct conversations and not be afraid to have difficult direct conversations with community organizations, with churches, with individuals, with our immigrant communities. And by the way, one of the things I'll mention is we don't differentiate between legal immigrants and undocumented immigrants in our plan, and that's very much on purpose. We think immigrants as a whole contribute to our city, and we didn't see a need to differentiate. Again, that's something that may not be true for municipalities depending on their history, size, and scale, but I think it's something that you really need to be attuned to, or what are the political realities, what are some of the shifting demographics, where are there potential allies within city government, and how do you build on those relationships, and maybe build by doing things that are seen as slightly less controversial and build towards some of the more difficult policies that may, the ones that may be harder to implement both politically and from just an implementation standpoint.
Great. Thank you, Adolfo. And I know we're running a little late. We want to leave lots of room for questions. So I just want to close my formal interview with you, which I think is a natural segue from your last response, to just talk very briefly about the work that you're doing with other cities in this new Welcoming Cities initiative, which is a way to really help a number of cities in very different parts of the country with very different agendas and contexts to move forward on whatever continuum they can towards greater immigrant integration and community inclusion. So if you might want to do a quick shout out, and then we'll open it up to questions.
Sure, and I think this is a really important one. Again, as I mentioned, one of the things that was clear to me is it couldn't just be about what's going to work here for Chicago. As we know that the mayor and the city has a national profile. So what could we do to also create models for other cities and municipalities around the country? But we also wanted to throw down a challenge. Again, mayors and cities are competitive. The mayor has set an ambitious goal. And so we've been sharing, and what I should say is thank you to probably many of the groups or individuals on this call. I learned so much from my counterparts in cities around the country, whether it was New York or Miami or San Francisco or Boston or Houston, about the different initiatives they were doing there. So, this isn't a completely original plan. What is original about it is that it's looking at a comprehensive way that a city can support immigrant integration. And what's also developed as part of this is we've been co-leading an effort with Welcoming America to create a dialogue and a space for cities and my counterparts around the country to have a space for information sharing for best practices, which when I took this role, when I accepted this role, would have been great to learn about what are the different initiatives that are working really well in other places, maybe what are some of the ones that aren't working as well, because it makes it sort of a clearinghouse of information and resources. And I believe welcomingcities.org recently launched. We're working on an effort to make sure that cities have that opportunity to to learn from each other, that we can share our best practices, our lessons learned, up-to-the-date information about maybe what's happening at the federal level that affects us at the local level and vice versa. And for more information about our plan, you can always please feel free to reach out to me directly. You can also visit cityofchicago.org/New Americans.
Thanks a lot. Kim, we'll turn it back to you.
Okay. Thank you, Adolfo and Suzette, for that rich exchange on about the kind of ideas that are transforming cities like Chicago, and helping us understand, how we can take some of that work forward. I hope you've all in our audience learned as much as we have from this interesting discussion. We've concluded now the formal part of our session, and we're turning to the Q&A. So I'm going to post questions from our audience, and I encourage you to continue to submit questions into the box as we go. Sunito Maiko, I can echo her remarks. She thanks you all for the information and encourages everyone to continue sharing practices. I wish everyone online could see the amount of chat and the kind of information that's being exchanged. So that's a great way to continue here. Now, the first thing we're going to do is clear some basic questions up about the frame that Chicago has put on this. I have a question from Ratna Omidvar at the Maitrey Foundation. She'd like to know simply how you define immigrants in terms of their status.
Again, this was an interesting conversation with our advisory committee where we talked about, one, folks that may be undocumented, where we looked at people who were legal permanent residents, and even whether we were going to consider children of immigrants, and we decided that who may be citizens. So one of the things that was very clear to us is that we have families with all sorts of mixed status, and that to just highlight one or the other would be to the detriment of the intention of the plan and of the goal of being a welcoming and inclusive city. So we decided to not explicitly state which immigrants we were referring to. Obviously, something like our citizenship initiative would focus on legal permanent residents, and our access to services, because most of them aren't directly federally funded, we could make available to people regardless of their status, so whether they're citizens or not. So people can attend our schools, can get a library card, can interact with our police departments, and access our family and support services. I think the only place that we explicitly referenced undocumented folks was when referencing our deferred action for undocumented youth, and that was because it's sort of this incredible moment in history where we have our young people that have an opportunity to have some type of status which allows them to work, and we wanted to make sure that our young people who were attending college had a clear goal at the end, and that they were encouraged to finish high school, to attend college, because there was an opportunity for them to work at the end of all their effort.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. Now, I've got a couple of questions, as we always do, about funding. Sarah Weiland writes, how did your initiative find the financial resources to pursue your plan? Was it all derived locally and approved by City Council? And if so, did you have to sell it to get that approval? Ricardo Gambetta, again on the financial question, he greets you from the U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants, and asks about the funding resources for this office in Chicago. What is the annual budget allocated for the office?
That's a very easy question. That's a very easy question to answer, in that the amount originally allocated to this office was $0. So I'm throwing down a challenge right now to anyone on this call who has $0 to create their own plan. What was interesting here is when I took this role, there were officially no numbers, no dollar amount allocated to it. A lot of what we're doing, we will need to find new sources of funding for, innovative sources of funding. Again, that's why I referenced the partnerships being absolutely critical. There was no way we were going to be able to implement all of this on our own. What I've costed out this plan to implement all of the initiatives would cost about $6 million, which isn't as high a cost as one would assume. What's been interesting is we've been able to implement several of these initiatives by finding outside sponsors and partners, by partnering innovatively with community-based organizations that may have funding for certain pieces of their work, And what I also knew is that we have an entire infrastructure of services. We have a Chicago public school system with 40,000 employees. We have a Business Affairs and Consumer Protection Agency. We have a Family and Support Services Agency. A lot of what this plan does is reallocate and repurpose some existing staff or reorient some of their goals, where before things like language access wasn't something that was measured or important. It's something that will be included into one of the agency budgets as opposed to a line item in a budget just for immigrants. So I think this is one of the points that's really important to looking at how we institutionalize these changes, is it can't be just an immigration budget. Each agency, whether it's your police department, your park district, your library, this plan is going to have budget implications for all of them. And this is something that's important to make sure that any changes, any programs, any initiatives that we launch are long-term and become part of agency culture, not just part of one office that's only thinking about this issue. Ultimately, I would love it if there was no need for an Office of New Americans because every city agency had someone thinking about it, had a budget line item for it. And because the mayor's placed such a high priority on this issue, every agency is responsive. So, I think that in a lot of ways we're lucky that the mayor has taken such a strong approach on this, which has helped other city agencies and departments jump on board. And to be quite honest, they were part of helping to create this plan. They were very aware of where they were weak in certain areas or where they had gaps. And so I made sure that they were part of the planning process as well. We didn't want to include anything in the plan that was absolutely impossible. So I would say that's another important part of it. Those aren't easy conversations to have, but we've managed to raise over $1 million from sort of these private partnerships and sponsorships.
Oh, that's fascinating. You've actually answered a number of the questions that are coming in. Hi, Suzette, yes?
Can I just chime in with one small point about New York City, which is that the exact situation that Adolfo describes is also the case in New York City, which might have marginally more money, maybe 2 people in their office instead of just Adolfo in Chicago. But again, it's more like a bully pulpit. It's taking the tone and the leadership from the mayor, and Mayor Bloomberg is also very committed to these issues, and translating that into working across agencies to do what Adolfo says, to repurpose existing funding, existing programs so that they work in concert with one another, and you institutionalize good practice. It's less about line items in budgets specifically dedicated to the programs of the Office of New Americans.
Okay, very good. I've got a question here from Amy Marquilidon. She asks whether you faced resistance to the plan. If so, by whom and how you overcame it. Bit of a
again, I think this is one of those questions that, if I were doing this plan in a city 30 minutes outside of Chicago, chances are I would have faced some resistance. So again, being in a bit of a bubble, I think shelters me and this office from maybe some of the organized public opposition to this. So again, I guess it's been relatively an easy path in that we haven't had that kind of external opposition. But I think that's going to be difficult for some cities to take this kind of approach. But that's why our sort of my advice to other cities that may not have the same political environment are, what are the pieces of the plan that are possible? So just because you couldn't do an entire comprehensive approach doesn't mean you can't take steps to make yourself more welcoming. And I think that's part of what we're working on through the Welcoming Cities initiative with Welcoming America, is identifying or creating more of a menu of options. What are the steps you can take given a political reality or a budgetary reality? And some cities may be able to move faster on some issues and much slower on others. And I think that the point we've made is, because we're in a bubble, we're going to push fast and hard on all of them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great. Okay. Now I have a couple of questions here on the business incubation and related issues amongst skilled immigrants. So Onika writes in, she is interested, of course, in what other cities have joined you in this effort, but let's focus on her question. She notes that while the emphasis on small business is laudable, important, what steps are being taken to help those who want to continue working in their chosen careers as physicians, lawyers, architects, etc.?
One of the things we've done with our city colleges in general, and we have about 6 city colleges that serve over 120,000 students, each one has been repurposed to focus on an industry where we will have skill shortages in the coming 10, 15 years. So whether that's in healthcare, transportation and logistics management, advanced manufacturing. So one of the things is each of these city colleges will have a specific focus on one of those areas. What we've asked the city colleges to also do is look at how we can revamp our credentialing process to give people credit for either work experience or schooling experience that they may have had in their country of origin. So that is specifically outlined as one of our initiatives. We know we have a high-skilled workforce that isn't being utilized in our city. We also know that we are educating some of the most talented people in the country, in the world, and then we're sending them back home. So here are places where we will be active on things like comprehensive immigration reform, making sure that we have an increase in the number of visas for our highly skilled folks. But locally, we know what we can do is do a better job of convening our high-skilled students, our college graduates in the STEM fields particularly, with some of our biggest employers in the city. We know that some corporations do a great job of working through the visa process and sponsoring some students and some doing a fairly good job of it. We know that most of them don't. So as a city, we can't force them to do it, but we can provide them with information, and we have a convening power to bring those corporations together. Just last year, we actually convened a visit with some of the top tech companies in the city, and we did a visit to a few of the state universities to tell this story, and that we would be willing to connect and convene both these high-skilled immigrant talent with some of our largest companies in the city, and that we would provide some information to these companies about how they can sponsor and how the process works. So I think we're looking at it as, one, how do we attract the best talent in the world, how we take the talent that's here and make sure that we're using them fully, and also how we're developing a pipeline of talent for the future.
Thank you. This is just great. We've got time for we're going to go over time by 5 or 10 minutes, just because we have so many questions, and we started with a shorter session. I have one really interesting question from Caroline in Toronto, who notes that recent immigrants often rely on public transit to access jobs in our city and region. She asks what role public transit plays in the Chicago plan. So, Adolfo?
Sure. That's a great question, and I should say Toronto is such a great place, and it's one of the places that I look to for quite a bit around their immigrant welcoming and integration. So great job, Toronto. But what I will say is that this plan doesn't cover everything. Some of the things that other city agencies or departments were working on, we had a Department of Cultural Affairs doing a cultural plan for the city. We had our Department of Transportation, CTA, putting together some transportation plans for the city. What we wanted to make sure was that the immigrant perspective was represented in each of those plans, as opposed to having this plan do everything for everyone in the city. So that's one of the things I think we did to great success, is making sure that my office or that someone from our advisory committee is represented on the different planning processes around the city. And here's another way I think that it's important that you sort of infiltrate these different decision-making opportunities to impact what the outcomes are for our immigrant communities. So one of the things that we've identified is we want to increase the amount of tourism to our immigrant neighborhoods. And so we're actually looking at a wayfinding system, and I think this is what you're describing, is how people get around our city. And it's not just difficult for new immigrants, it's actually difficult for tourists. So here's another way where we're looking at not just the benefit to the immigrant community, but the benefit to the city as a whole. What if immigrants could move more, what if tourists could move more freely, more easily around our city? So here's a chance to bring in multiple partners, maybe your chambers of commerce, maybe your tourism agencies, maybe some of your local tour operators, where they might not consider themselves immigrant advocates, but they're going to be 100% with you in terms of being a global city, that's providing easy travel information to both tourists, and that's going to have a great sort of impact on immigrants as well when you have information on how to get around in multiple languages. So it's actually something that we're looking at, is creating a wayfinding system as part of our immigrant neighborhood tourism strategies.
Great. Fred Gittner at Queens Library, Ana Carlos Rosario, Adult Education in Washington, D.C., asks, what is the importance of building cross-cultural understanding or common ground between different immigrant groups and non-immigrant groups, and how does this fit into your plan? This question was also raised by someone else online today who wanted to know whether you had resistance from any of the historical cultural communities in Chicago to your immigrant newcomer strategy.
Again, those are really great questions, and I think that's maybe the one area in the plan that we don't specifically address. And I think part of what and that's really on purpose, part of what I viewed our role as a city, as a municipality, are what were some of the things we could do from a policy perspective to integrate our immigrants and make them feel welcome. And I think you're right, there is a piece that's missing in terms of what those cross-cultural communications and opportunities were for sharing. One of the things, and the Queens Library is again, another great model of ESL, GED, sort of these cultural conversations. It's also one of the places I look to. What we're looking at is how we turn our libraries, which we have over 70 of in the city of Chicago, into more of cultural hubs or welcoming centers that serve as part of that space, where we're allowing not just people to come in and get library cards, but we're encouraging them to come in for information about city services and access to services, where we're hosting ESL and GED classes. And we're pretty soon we'll be working out some partnership with USCIS to do similar that's something that LA did, which launched naturalization hubs at their city libraries. So we want our libraries to be immigrant welcoming hubs, and we think that will provide a venue for some of this cross-cultural collaboration, because we think those are these great public spaces. We'll also do it at some of our public festivals, which allow people from all around the city to really come in and share in one space. But I think that's actually another way that the NGO community plays a role, and it's important that you have these strong partnerships, because I don't think that's a strength of the city. Strength of the city isn't maybe creating these dialogues, but it's certainly a strength of NGOs, and it certainly is a strength of NGOs here in the city of Chicago. And it's one of the spaces that I think they help us fill a gap where we don't necessarily have the expertise or the knowledge of how to do it, but we might have the spaces, and we're willing to work with groups on allowing them to use those spaces for free. And that's how I see our role is. We're not going to be everything to everyone, but we always have something that we can bring to the table.
Great. Well, I think that's a wonderful way to close this webinar. I'm just going to ask the last question, I think, because it segues to sort of to when we can get an update from you. Kevin M. in Baltimore's IRC, he's interested in how the plan is being operationalized and asks, how do you make sure it's being implemented? So I'm confident, Adolfo, that some of the measures that you described earlier in the session are going to help you ensure that it's implemented. When can we next expect to hear from Chicago on how you're doing?
That's a great question. One of the things that the mayor met with our advisory committee members when we were finally ready to present our plan to him, and one of the things he said very clearly is, I look forward to a meeting with the same group next year, and I want to hear about the update and status. One of the things, it's a full plan, 56-page plan with a 20-something page executive summary. What I have sitting on my desk is about a 350-page document that outlines sort of a sequencing of events. A lot of these initiatives rely on what happens before. So some initiatives make sense to do in tandem, some it makes sense to do in different phases. So this is why we anticipated a 3 to 4 month process when putting together our plan. It actually took a little closer to 6 to 7 months. And I should say is we had great assistance from a local nonprofit, the Chicago Civic Alliance. What they made sure we did, the Civic Consulting Alliance, what they made sure we did was have some external capacity to help facilitate the process, not provide content, but more facilitate, pull out ideas, and streamline them. And I worked very closely with them to create this 350-page implementation plan. And again, so many cities or so many city plans sit on a shelf because they're full of great ideas, but as the ideas were being put on paper, there was no talk about how they would get implemented, what a timeline would look like, who the potential partners would be, what some of the costs would be. And we knew we didn't have to figure it all out, but we knew we could figure out some of that stuff if we did it in tandem. So we simultaneously worked on this external plan, but we also worked on an internal plan. We met with our city agencies and departments to make sure that they were maybe pushing them a bit, but that they were still feasible. And so I think anyone who's taking this on, you should, while thinking about developing a program or a set of policies or programs, that you're also thinking about what implementation will look like. And don't let it stop you if it's too difficult, but also make sure it's something that's achievable and feasible.
Well, thank you very much, Adolfo. Thank you, Suzette. We're at the end of our QA. I would like to close by asking Adolfo just one or two really short, what we call a short-fire question. Adolfo, if you could choose one word, or maybe two, one word to choose to describe the most important secret to your success, what would it be?
Community.
Community. And for both of you, in a nutshell, what's next on your horizon, Adolfo?
Well, we've been very supportive of driver's licenses legislation here in the state of Illinois, where we're only the 4th state in the country to offer something like it, and the mayor has been such a strong advocate for it. What we're developing now is a little outside of just the municipal focus. It's looking at what we're going to push for as this federal conversation is happening on comprehensive immigration reform. As I said earlier, we're not just tolerating immigration. We want more of it to our city. And so we're developing strategies to present to the President, to the White House, and to some of our congressional representatives to say why it's important to our city to have a good, sensible, comprehensive immigration reform package, and why it'll be beneficial to our cities. The other thing I'll be looking at is this 350-page document sitting on my desk, which is it's my guiding light every single day.
Bravo. Thank you. And Suzette, what's the next big idea for you?
Well, it's probably, believe it or not, lifting up the work that cities are doing. I think cities are doing some of the most creative work in the immigrant integration field, and so trying to really help foster that movement of sharing and envelope pushing, and have that somehow influence the federal immigrant integration approach, which really has been lacking in the United States. So really having cities lead the way.
That's great. Okay. Well, thank you. And to our audience, thank you. Our time has run out. We will try to get some of those unanswered questions to our presenters and back to you online. But for now, on behalf of Cities of Migration and all of our participants, I want to thank Adolfo Hernandez from Chicago's Office of New Americans and Suzette Brooks Masters from the J.M. Kaplan Fund for wonderful presentations. I'd like you all to imagine this excellent work being interpreted in your own city, adapted by your own organization, or changing the neighborhood you live in. So we'd love to hear more stories from all of you. We want to continue sharing good practices, so please stay connected.